Hi, in this video I want to give you a tool for observing the train of thought in a individual passage. I'm talking a small passage, maybe 5 or 10 verses. Of course you could do this for an entire book of the Bible, but I want you to use this as a tool for being able to explore listening to a text. We are, as it were, exploring literary evidence in this video. So there's two kinds of evidence that you bring to bear when you're trying to listen to a biblical text, frankly, when you're trying to listen to any text. There are two kinds of evidence that you bring to bear when you want to read it for what it actually meant, for what was likely or most likely going on in the mind of the person writing it and or a person reading it in its original context, somebody who's informed in the world of that text. So there are two kinds of evidence that you bring to bear. You can tease them out. In fact, until you become really good at reading texts in context, you might intentionally separate these two kinds of evidence. So first of all, there is historical evidence. This comes from the world behind the text. If you're reading something from a context that's vastly different from your context, you may not know all of the things that are alluded to, all the things that are referred to. You may not know what a talent is in the parable of the talents. You might assume that a talent is being able to play the guitar or something like that because that's what it means in your world. But the original meaning of the parable of the talent in the Bible is going to come from the world behind it, which was 2,000 years ago, where a talent was an obscene amount of money. So there is historical evidence. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of historical evidence to determine the meaning of all texts. The meaning of many, many biblical texts is what we might call underdetermined, which means that we simply do not have enough historical information or contextual information from the world behind the text to know for certain what it actually meant, what its precise meaning, what its original connotations were. We often don't have enough historical evidence to speak with certainty as to what a text actually meant. What we do have is literary evidence. Literary evidence is the text itself. And here I mean the text of Romans or the text of 1 Corinthians or the text of Ephesians, because of course these books were originally written separately. They were not written to be read in the light of each other. Galatians is part of the historical context of Romans, not the literary context of Romans. Just because I buy the Bible as one book doesn't mean that when I read it in context I should read the whole Bible as part of the literary context of say, Romans. No, the literary context of Romans is the 16 chapters of Romans. So literary evidence is evidence from the text itself. The tool that I'm going to present in this video is a tool that asks you to listen in a way that you may not normally listen to a particular passage. And what I'm asking you to do is to pretend like you're from a different planet, or pretend like you have come from a part of the world where nobody knows anything about Christianity. You know English, or if you're reading it in the original, you know Greek, or you know Hebrew, or you know Aramaic if you're reading part of Daniel. So you know the language, let's say, but you don't know anything about the Bible or Christianity in terms of what it thinks about stuff. I want to suggest this tool for you to observe a passage of text as if you knew nothing, not even who Jesus was, so that you're going to observe the things that seem clear grammatically, and even that won't always be 100% certain. Grammar is the reason why there are different translations of the Bible. Isn't just because of ideological differences. A lot of times the grammar of the original language is just susceptible to being translatable in more than one way. But let's say that you know the language, and so you can observe some basic grammatical and syntactical features of the original. What questions, though, would you have? Questions like, who is Jesus? Or who is Moses? Questions like that. So we're going to empty our mind of all of our, we can't, but we're going to try to empty our mind of our assumptions, pretend like we don't know anything about anything. And we're going to ask questions about the text itself. We're not going to look at commentaries for this assignment. We're not going to read what other people say. We're not going to go to the internet. We're not going to ask our pastor, or we're not going to ask ourselves if we are a pastor. We're just going to listen as best we can to the text itself and play dumb and try to generate questions. You may find that there are assumptions you were making that you didn't even know you were assuming. But when you play dumb, you're going to realize the assumptions that you have, the glasses that you yourself have been wearing when reading the text. Well, that's introduction. Let's dive into. Well, first of all, I want to talk about some basic categories of things to look for when you're observing a text. What are some basic things that you might try to observe? Until you become kind of second nature in doing this observation, you might actually go through this list each time you're looking at a text. Let's say you're getting ready to preach a sermon. You might ask these questions. You might take that text. Some people still have hard copies of the Bible. Some people still have paper Bibles. Go find a copier. Copy the text that you are going to be looking at, and just start marking it up. Start observing things. And here are some of the things that you might look for. First of all, what are some key terms? Usually a passage, there are a whole bunch of terms in a passage, lots of words. But certain words are more important for understanding that passage than others. What are they? So key terms are the words or key phrases that you need to know in order to understand the passage. Now, words have meanings and contexts. You don't find the meaning of a word just by going to a dictionary. You have to wed the dictionary with the passage you're looking at. Context determines meaning, not the dictionary. Dictionary doesn't tell a text what a word means. A dictionary is a popularity context, and I have a video on YouTube on how to do a word study. But that has to do with, word studies have to do with answering questions of what words mean. This is an observation assignment. So for this assignment, I don't want you to observe what words mean. I want you to ask what key words mean. So you might observe, wow, this phrase, the righteousness of God, seems like a key phrase in Romans chapter 3, verse 21, I think it is. What does it mean? And leave it at that. Look at the cake, don't eat it. Observe the cake. Wow, that cake has a prominent, picture of a man and a woman on it. Who are these people? Maybe you think you know, but for this assignment, don't eat the cake. Just ask the question. Well, who is this man? Who is this woman on the cake? Okay, so one thing to observe are key terms. Another thing to observe are key morphological features. This is grammar. So there are aspects of Hebrew verbs, there are aspects of Greek verbs, there are aspects of Hebrew nouns, there are aspects of Greek nouns, and a whole lot more. Now, most pastors don't know Greek and Hebrew, and those that think they do probably don't know it as well as they think they do. Basically, there are aspects to grammar that you can't really know unless you have spent some time learning Greek and Hebrew. This is a place where you might get some help from a commentary, but commentaries also tend to disagree. For the purposes of this assignment, don't go to a commentary. If you want to use an interlinear, such as you might find at interlinearbible.org, you can get some sense of possible grammatical features that you might ask questions about from an interlinear, which it's called an interlinear because the translation is put in between the lines, linear, in between lines of Greek or in between lines of Hebrew. You can actually get quite a bit from just looking at an interlinear, even if you can't read the Greek and Hebrew, just by seeing how the English seems to be laid out underneath the Greek or underneath the Hebrew may raise some questions that you'll want to ask. And then when you get to the answering the question stage, then you can go to commentaries and things to try to figure out what's going on. So I just want you to know that this exists. If you were an expert on the Bible, you would know these things. You're simply not an expert on the Bible if you don't know Greek and Hebrew. It's just the way it is. Deal with it. But you can certainly do an awful lot and do pretty well with interpretation without knowing Greek and Hebrew. But I just want you to know that there is this phase of looking at the grammatical features of the Greek and observing them and asking questions about the Greek and Hebrew behind whatever English translation you happen to be using. Okay, connecting words. Connecting words are so helpful in following the train of thought. And by train of thought, I mean, a train has cars, a train is on a track, a train doesn't have three cars side by side in parallel. A train has a car, and then a car, and then a car, and then a car. So in a passage, it's that way too. You have a verse, and a verse, and a verse, and a verse. So how do you go from one verse to one verse in understanding the train, how the train is lined up? That's what we're talking about here. Connecting words are very helpful in following a train of thought because they make explicit the relationship between verse 1 and verse 2. So there are what are called coordinating conjunctions. You may know that song from Saturday morning cartoons years ago. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Hooking up words and phrases and clauses. So the conjunctions are the connecting words that connect the cars of the train, connect the verses of the train together. Some of these have some significant meaning to them. Now, and isn't very helpful, probably, but always implies a contrast. But means that the thing that follows is different in some way from the thing that came before. Therefore, expresses cause and effect of some kind. It could be that this idea causes this or leads to this idea. Or it could be that this event led to this event. The word for goes the opposite direction. For either explains or substantiates. It goes from effect to cause, as it were. And so when the word for is there, you should expect that verse to explain or expand or substantiate upon the verse that came before. These kinds of conjunctions are very, very helpful in understanding what the text was saying. Subordinating conjunctions are where the conjunctions aren't on the same level, but where you have a statement that clarifies or in some way qualifies, modifies the basic statement of the sentence. So, in order that expresses purpose, or it can also express result. Usually these in Greek, for example, it's the same conjunctions serve double duty to either express purpose or result. Purpose looks at it from the standpoint of planning beforehand. This is done in order that a certain thing might follow. Result focuses more on what happens at the other end. This happened with the result that. So they're very closely related. But there are conjunctions in Greek especially that are worth knowing and seeing in the interlinear because they express purpose or result. The conjunction hina or the conjunction hosta expresses result. Hina can express either purpose or result. So in order that, this is helpful to observe in a passage. There are if clauses that express conditions. Again, if you know Greek, there's more than one word for if, with slightly different nuances. Causal clauses. These are clauses that begin with words like because or since. And the because clause or the since clause gives you the cause behind something. There are temporal clauses that tell you when. So words like while or after or when. There are relative clauses, who or which or that. These expand upon a noun. So this is the man whom I was talking about. Or this is the subject that you learned about. So these clauses expand upon a noun. The gospel concerning Jesus Christ, who is the son of David according to the flesh, expands upon who Jesus is. Concessive clauses make exceptions, although in many ways, in various ways, God spoke formally through the prophets. In these last days, He's spoken through His Son. Concessive clauses always imply a partial contrast. So those are conjunctions that help you clarify the relationships between one thought and the next. Sometimes there isn't an explicit conjunction. Sometimes you have to infer the connection. And there is a finite number of ways in which one thought can relate to the next. So a thought can be repeated. Repetition usually implies emphasis. Two thoughts can be similar. This can be like that. Like or as imply comparison. Metaphors imply comparison. There can be contrast. Like I mentioned, the word but implies contrast. Although implies some sort of a partial contrast, where this is different from what follows. General to particular. You can have a general statement that then is played out in its details, or you can have details that lead up to a general statement. And I think Matthew 5:48. Therefore, both it has a cause-effect element because of the therefore. Then it says, "Be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect." There's a comparison there, like your heavenly Father is perfect. And then it's a general statement that I think encapsulates everything that's gone before in the paragraph it's in, and as well in the most of the chapter 5 of Matthew. So again, these are things that you process subconsciously because you know English, but looking for them. Just going through this list and asking, is there a contrast in these 5 verses? Is there a comparison in these 5 verses? And if you've photocopied the passage, you can create your own system. You know, I circle key terms, and I underline conjunctions, you know, or however you want to do it. But write it up as a kind of spade work to churn up the soil as you're getting ready to preach or to interpret a passage. Maybe you're about to do a Bible study with a group. Photocopy the passage and then go through this list and churn up the soil. Other logical relationships. You can have this cause-effect movement from one verse to another. You can have a statement of means, by means of something, by an instrument, by the love of God, or something like that. You can have a logical cause-effect, where this idea leads to the next idea, and it can go the other direction. Some of these overlap with the conjunctions. The conjunctions are helpful because they make these relationships explicit, but they can also be implied. Simply by putting 2 verses next to each other, there may be a relationship between those 2 verses that you can infer just by asking, what is the relationship between this verse and the next? I mentioned statement of purpose with certain conjunctions. You can have a statement of purpose. You can move from problem to solution in a passage. You can move from a question to an answer. So if you were doing an observation of the first part of Romans 6, you know, what shall we say? Should we continue in sin that grace may abound? No. You know, so there's the question and answer in the train of thought of Romans 6. Finally, and I know I'm going quickly, but this is a video, so you can slow it down and watch it and stop it and listen to it again. Finally, there are some miscellaneous features that a passage can have that you might want to look for. So sometimes a passage will say things literally, and sometimes a passage will have figurative expressions. When the Bible talks about the trees clapping their hands, probably that's not literal. They're not going to literally sprout physical hands that are going to clap like that. Probably that's a figure of speech. And so you might ask, are there figurative elements in this passage? What does it mean for the sun to be darkened and the moon to be turned to blood? Is that a literal thing we're going to observe, or is that apocalyptic literature language, similar to when I say, boy, that was an earth-shattering event, and I may not be talking about any real movement of the earth. You know, it's an expression. So there are figurative things that were meant to be taken figuratively in Scripture, and so look for them, see if there are any in a passage. There can be tone to a passage. This is, of course, takes a little bit more skill, I think, to pick up on. But there are moments where Paul is sarcastic. When he tells the Corinthians, isn't there anybody wise enough there, to figure this out without having to go to court? Given the fact that some of the Corinthians are boasting about wisdom, I think there's a little tone there. We, in Western culture, are focused on the logos meaning of Scripture, the truth meaning, the idea, cognitive meaning. But ancient persuasion perfectly accepted pathos and ethos as modes of persuasion. The ethos is the securing the goodwill of the person that you're writing. I think a lot of Galatians 1 and 2 is Paul securing the goodwill of the Galatians in his letter by recounting the story. I think 1 Thessalonians, the first 3 chapters, is largely given to reminding the Thessalonians of Paul's shared history with them and securing their goodwill and their confidence in him on an ethos level. Pathos is that sarcasm, emotional, pulling on the heartstrings. I always think of the book of Philemon here, where Paul basically says to one individual within the church, Philemon, in front of the whole church, because this is a letter to the whole church, he basically asks Philemon to receive the slave Onesimus back, the servant Onesimus back, in front of the whole church. I mean, everybody's looking at Philemon. What's he going to do? Is he going to listen to Paul? I mean, that really ups the emotional honor-shame stakes, and I think that was perfectly acceptable in Paul's day to do. So there are sometimes tone. There is sometimes tone to biblical passages, and it's worth asking, is there any tone in this passage? Intertextuality. Sometimes, especially New Testament texts, interact with Old Testament texts and sometimes pagan texts. in the process. And if we don't realize that, then we may very well miss some of the meaning of the passage that the audience would have known because they knew those other texts. There may even be some Old Testament texts that interact with other Old Testament texts. So always be looking on the lookout for intertextuality, which is one text alluding to another text. There may be items of historical cultural interest that you'll need to look into. These are, again, for this exercise, you're not answering them, you're just asking. So what is a talent in terms of the passage? I need to know historical evidence to do that. If I'm reading Luke verse 2 about the census of Augustus, I'm going to need to know who is Augustus and that sort of thing. So there may be questions you'll want to raise about the historical cultural context, not to answer in this assignment, but simply to raise them to pursue later on. And then if you're in narratives, looking at point of view may be a significant thing to do, because you don't want to just take Job's comforter's word for it. You want to realize that Job's comforters are wrong on their basic idea of what's going on with Job. Even Job's not completely right. God comes in at the end of Job and corrects even Job. So be cautious in knowing what the point of view of what you're reading. You know, when you're reading Satan's point of view, you want to be very careful about applying that to today. So there, in a nutshell, are some things that you might want to look for when you're observing a text. Let's say you're getting ready to preach or getting ready to lead a Bible study. Take the passage, blow it up with a copier, print it off, get some colored pencils or something, create your own code, look for key terms, look for morphological features, switching, the way the first person plural, that kind of thing. Look for conjunctions, very important. Look for thought relationships that are implicit in the passage as it moves from one thought to the next. Look for these other miscellaneous features like tone and intertextuality. So you've done your spade work. You've plowed the soil. You're now ready to go to the assignment, which you wouldn't have to write this up, obviously, if you're preparing for a sermon. But you might want to do it mentally, and if you're doing it for one of my classes, do it literally. So how do you follow a train of thought and write it up? Well, I'd suggest, first of all, pray. God can help our minds to function well as our hearts. And this may be a somewhat scientific assignment. We're making observations and gathering evidence, but that doesn't mean that God can't help us to see what he wants us to see. Use a good formal equivalence translation for observation. I have no problem with dynamic translations. I don't even have a problem with free translations or paraphrases. But for this kind of assignment, you're wanting to see detail. And to see detail, you're going to need a translation that sticks fairly closely to the word order and sentence structure of the original. Now, by the way, an interlinear might be even better than using one of these translations that I have listed down here. The NIV is fine. The NIV 211 is perfectly fine for this assignment as well. Now, warning, view this as a tentative assignment. This is what I said at the beginning of this video. This is a literary evidence assignment. This is not about interpretation yet. That is to say, it's not about answering the meaning of this passage. It's about generating questions as if we didn't know anything. Remember, we're playing dumb. We're acting like we didn't know anything about the passage. So prepare yourself to look at the train of thought by summing up the relevant. So first, you might put in your assignment the passage in a formal equivalence translation. Or you might kind of clean up an interlinear. That would be great. Just look at an interlinear like you would find at interlinearbible.org, and then kind of clean it up as far as English is concerned. That's perfectly legitimate. So that you started out by giving me the passage. Then give me the literary context. In other words, where have we gone before we get to this train? Before we get to the verses we're looking at. What's gone on in the literary context leading up to the verses we're looking at? Prepare yourself to look at the train of thought in a specific passage by summing up relevant details from the literary context in which that passage is located. And there are two layers of that kind of literary context. One is broader literary context. What aspects of the broader book has set us up for these verses. And then immediate literary context, which is more important for this assignment. What is happening in the text right before your passage starts? Okay, so give me the text and then give me some immediate literary context. You can put some broader in there too, but what is the context right before we get to the verses I'm focusing on? Now go thought by thought. Now, a lot of times I'll have my classes go verse by verse just because that's the simplest thing to do. But if you really wanted to do this right, knowing that the verse divisions were added in the 1500s, the verse divisions were not part of the original Bible. In fact, some people joke about the guy who did them, Stephanus, maybe his horse skipping at certain points, leaving us with really odd verses at some time. So if you really wanted to do this perfectly or really do it right, you would forget about going verse by verse and you would go thought by thought. But often in my classes, I'm okay with going verse by verse just because usually in my classes, we're getting started with this task. We're not necessarily hardcore with it. So feel free to go verse by verse. But in a perfect world, you would go thought by thought. And you would basically organize your different parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, by sentences rather than by verses. Now, the problem, of course, with people like Paul is Paul can go on for 10 verses in the same sentence. I think it's either 1 Thessalonians 1 to 10 or 2 Thessalonians 1 to 10. I can't remember. It's just one long verse in Greek. Of course, if you're using an English translation, it's very likely that the translator has chopped up a sentence like that into smaller English sentences. Sentence by sentence or meaningful bit by meaningful bit, you can number it yourself. You don't have to follow the verse divisions of the Bible. Again, simplest, if you're a beginner, is just to go verse by verse. So, you're asking, how does the train of thought go? How does one paragraph flow into the next? Now, if you're doing this for 5 to 10 verses, probably you're doing it for a paragraph. You're probably not doing it for more than a paragraph. But if you're following the train of thought of an overall passage, you would want to know, how does one paragraph flow into the other? How does one sentence flow into the next? How does one thought flow into the next? How does and so forth? How does one clause flow into another? So number each thought bit. If you're creating your own train of thought and not following the verses, then create your own numbering of thought by thought as you go through it. Now make observations of each thought using the categories that I talked about at the beginning of this video. So how does each thought, or how does each verse, connect to the thought or verse that came before? How do the clauses flow from one to the next? A clause is, if I say Spot runs, that's a clause and a sentence. But you do have some clauses that are only parts of a sentence. A clause has a subject and a verb. So if I say, so that I could get out on time, that's not a sentence. It's not a complete thought. It's a subordinate clause. But how does so you can observe how one clause flows into the next. He let out class early so that he could get to the next class. That has two clauses. He let out class early and so that he could get to the next class. That all makes one sentence, but how does one clause flow into the next? It's a purpose connection between one clause and the next. He let out class early in order that he might get to the next class. So how does one clause flow into the next clause? What are the key terms? What are some significant grammatical features? And so forth. Remember, this is primarily a literary assignment rather than a full interpretation. We are suspending our knowledge of background or our answers to background questions. We are pretending, we're playing dumb as if we didn't know anything. So how am I asking you to structure the assignment? Give me a formal equivalence of the text. Give me the immediate literary context, at least, maybe some broader literary context. Then go verse by verse or thought by thought. Tell me make some basic observations, and then ask questions. Ask questions about each passage. Make observations of each thought. Ask questions of each thought. Questions like questions of definition. Questions like who, what, where, when. Those are questions of definition. Why questions? How questions? So give me the passage, give me the verse, basic observations, and some basic questions. And then when you're done, you might end with a conclusion. How would you sum up your general sense of the train of thought? What are some questions you might go on to pursue when you bring historical background into play with that passage? Where does the text seem to go afterwards? Those are standard conclusion things. But the most important part of this following a train of thought assignment is play dumb, give me the verse or the thought, make observations that are kind of obvious, surface observations of the meaning of that text, given the things I've mentioned at the beginning of this video, and then raise questions like who, what, where, when, the questions of definition, why questions, how questions, questions of implication for the original meaning, and then conclusion when you're done with going through all the verses. There you have it, how to follow a train of thought and how to write it up for a quirky professor. Thank you.